Julia rushed through the crowded streets of downtown New York, her heart pounding in her chest. The autumn wind blew through the city, sharp and biting, as her thin jacket failed to shield her from the cold. In one hand she clutched a crumpled resume, the ink smudged from the rain that had poured earlier. In the other hand she held a small brown bag of food, the lunch she had barely eaten. Her hair was hastily tied back, strands of it falling loose from the messy ponytail. She didn't have time to fix it. There was no time for anything. Her mind raced, bouncing from one thought to the next. The interview, the job she needed more than anything. She could already picture herself in the office, sitting behind a desk, contributing to something bigger, something that could change her life. She had to land this job. She had to get it. But as she walked, she felt the weight of her failures press down on her shoulders. Her mind couldn't escape the disappointment of the past few months. Rejection after rejection, every interview that ended with a cold handshake and a "we'll let you know" made the weight heavier. She had tried everything. Each time she tried to push forward, something pulled her back into the endless cycle of struggling to make ends meet. She had just come from another interview, this time with a small tech startup, but once again they had told her the same thing. Not quite what we're looking for. And now, with nothing but a crumpled resume in her hand and the harsh reality of New York streets weighing on her, she was walking towards another dead end. She had learned long ago that the city would chew you up and spit you out if you let it. And it wasn't just the city that had worn her down. Life had been hard, too hard. At 24, Julia was already feeling like the world was slipping away. The dream of a better life felt like it was nothing more than an illusion, fading further, with every passing day. But today something felt different. Maybe it was the weather, the fact that the rain had stopped, or maybe it was the way the city's usual bustle seemed a little quieter. Either way, she had decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley behind a building she passed every day. The alley, usually filled with discarded newspapers and garbage, seemed strangely inviting today, like an escape from the chaos of the world around her. Her steps quickened, driven by a deep, almost unconscious desire to outrun the feeling of hopelessness that had been following her for months. As she neared the alley, she slipped, her foot sliding on the wet pavement. The brown bag of food flew out of her hand and her lunch, a simple meal of rice and chicken, scattered across the ground. Her heart sank. It wasn't just the food. It felt like the last of her dignity had spilled out along with it. Great, Julia muttered, sitting on the cold pavement, staring at the mess she had made. Perfect. Her hands trembled as she reached for what was left of her lunch, feeling the weight of the world settle on her shoulders. Another failure. Another moment in which she had nothing but scraps. As she stared at the ground, she didn't notice the man approaching her until he spoke. "Are you hurt?" The voice was deep, calm, and unexpected. Julia looked up, startled, to see a man standing in front of her. He was tall, his hair long and unkempt, and his face covered in a rough, unshaven stubble. His clothes were worn and ragged, clearly showing signs of being lived in for far too long. But despite the homeless appearance, there was something about him, something different. His eyes, they were calm, almost serene, but there was a sharpness to them, like he could see through her in ways she hadn't experienced before. "No, I'm fine," Julia said, feeling embarrassed but trying to maintain her composure. Just a little clumsy." The man crouched down, gently picking up the fallen container of food. He handed it back to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "There's still a little left," he said softly, his voice almost gentle despite the roughness of his appearance. Julia hesitated before taking the container from him, her eyes lingering on his face. "You live here?" she asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The man glanced around, his eyes scanning the alley, then looked back at her. "For now, yes, but it's temporary. I'm between two paths, who I was and who I will be." Julia's brow furrowed. She didn't understand. She had heard of people living on the streets, of course, but no one had ever spoken like this before. Not like him. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to push past the confusion in her mind. "David," he answered simply, his eyes still studying her. "Julia," she replied, feeling a strange connection to him. She stood up, dusting off her jeans. "Well, good luck, David." He nodded, watching her as she walked away. But despite her best efforts to put him out of her mind, something about that brief encounter stayed with her. His words, his eyes, the calm way he had handled everything. Julia didn't know it yet, but that moment would change everything. Days passed, and Julia found herself walking down the same alley again. It wasn't intentional. She was just too tired to take another route, too exhausted by the repetitive cycle of disappointment to care. And there he was, sitting on the curb, his back against a stack of cardboard boxes, looking up at the sky, as if waiting for something, someone. His gaze met hers when she passed by, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Hello again," David greeted her, his voice still as calm as ever. Julia didn't know why, but she found herself stopping. It was almost as if his presence was magnetic. Something about him made her feel like everything was going to be okay, even if just for a moment. "Hey," she said, smiling despite herself. "I guess I'm starting to see you every time I pass through. Here." David chuckled softly. "Maybe we're meant to cross paths. Who knows?" Julia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "How are you today?" He shrugged. "Better, still breathing." They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't uncomfortable, just peaceful. After a while, Julia spoke again, more to herself than to David. "I thought life would be easier, you know? I keep trying, and it feels like everything just falls apart." David glanced at her, his sharp eyes taking in the emotion that slipped through her guard. "Life is messy. You can try to control it, but sometimes you have to let it fall apart first before it gets better." Julia sighed, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside her. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for her. "I'm sorry," David said after a beat. "I didn't mean to bring the mood down." "No?" Julia replied quickly, her voice soft. "You're right. I needed to hear that." They shared a quiet moment, one where words weren't necessary. Julia didn't know why, but she had a feeling that David was a man who had seen things she couldn't even begin to comprehend. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't who he appeared to be. The days passed and Julia continued to walk through the alley on her way to various interviews and odd jobs. Every time she saw David, they exchanged a few words, but nothing more. He always remained a mystery, an enigma she couldn't quite solve. One cold afternoon, Julia turned the corner into the alley again, but this time something was different. David wasn't sitting on the curb. Instead, he was standing, leaning against the wall, his face pale and drawn. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an unmistakable exhaustion. "David," Julia called, concern flooding her voice. "Are you okay?" He turned his head slowly to face her. "I'm fine. Just a little cold." But as he spoke, Julia noticed the bandage around his foot, the one she had placed on him weeks ago, was now dirty and barely holding. The wound had become infected, and he could barely hide the shaking of his arms. Without thinking, Julia rushed to him. "You need help. Come with me." She didn't wait for him to protest. She just led him to her small apartment, a place she had always considered a temporary refuge. She had nothing to offer him, but she couldn't leave him out there in the cold. Not now. Once inside, she offered him a blanket, a hot cup of tea, and some food. David looked at her, surprised but grateful. They both knew this was only temporary, just one night. But it was enough. In the days that followed, Julia couldn't help but notice the strange calmness in David's presence. Even though he had nothing, he had a certain dignity that couldn't be ignored. She didn't know it yet, but that night would be the beginning of something that would change both of their lives. Julia had always been a believer in small miracles. Life had given her precious little, yet somehow she kept holding on. She had always been able to find some small joy, some glimmer of hope that kept her going, even in the darkest of times. But the past few weeks had been different. There was something about David that lingered in her thoughts long after their fleeting moments in the alley. His quiet strength, his calm, his unspoken understanding of the world. It was as if he had seen everything, been through everything, and still he remained unshaken. The first few days after he came into her apartment were filled with an uneasy stillness. David, ever the enigma, had been quiet, almost too quiet. Julia had offered him a place to stay for a night, but it quickly became clear that something in him had shifted. He didn't look at her with gratitude or as if he needed saving. He just accepted it, as though he was simply passing through a temporary stop on a journey of his own. There was no desperation in him, nothing that begged her for more than what she was already offering. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she was living with a man who was more than he seemed. As the days passed, she learned to accept David's presence in her life, even though she couldn't quite understand him. It was strange having someone like him in her small apartment, someone who seemed both detached from and yet oddly connected to the world around him. He didn't speak much of his past, and she never pushed. He had a way of existing in her life without demanding much, yet still leaving a deep impression. It was early one morning when Julia woke to find David standing in front of her kitchen window, staring out at the grey skyline. His back was straight, his posture impeccable, but his face wore an expression of quiet contemplation. Julia had become used to his silences, but something in this moment felt different. It was as if for the first time she saw a crack in the carefully constructed calm he always projected. "David?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his piercing eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. "I'm sorry if I've been distant," he said finally, his voice as steady as ever, but with an edge of something she hadn't heard before. Vulnerability, maybe, or perhaps just weariness. "I've had a lot on my mind." Julia nodded, her gaze softening. She wanted to ask him what was bothering him, but something told her it wasn't the time. Instead, she simply gestured toward the small kitchen table. "Coffee?" she asked, offering him the one thing she knew how to give him with certainty. It wasn't much, but it was something. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the table, sitting down and running a hand through his unkempt hair. There was something unspoken between them, a kind of understanding that neither of them fully grasped. Yet there was a connection, one that grew stronger with each passing day, though neither of them knew what it truly meant. Julia set the coffee down in front of him, watching his hands wrap around the mug. He didn't take a sip right away. Instead, his gaze was far away, lost in thoughts that were too heavy for her to bear. She thought about leaving him to his silence, but something urged her to stay. "David," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "you don't have to hide from me. Whatever it is, you can talk about it." He looked at her, and for the first time in days his calm exterior faltered. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something akin to fear or maybe regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'm not hiding from you," he said softly. "I'm hiding from myself." His words hit Julia harder than she expected. She didn't know what he meant, but she felt the weight of his burden. There was more to David than met the eye, and she knew deep down that whatever it was something dark and powerful enough to keep him from opening up completely. As the morning wore on, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. The air felt thick with unspoken words, but neither of them were ready to speak them. They lived in a space of silence that, in some strange way, made everything feel heavier. But it also made everything feel more real. The next few days were a blur. Julia went about her usual routine, running from interview to interview, taking odd jobs where she could find them, desperately trying to escape the trap of feeling like she was treading water. But it was impossible to ignore the growing presence of David in her life. The man she had once thought of as a stranger was now slowly becoming a part of her world in ways she didn't fully understand. It was on one of these days that Julia arrived home to find him standing by the window again. But this time something was different. The quiet, reflective man she had grown accustomed to was gone. Instead, there was a sense of urgency about him, a restlessness that she hadn't seen before. "I need to leave for a while," David said as soon as he saw her. His voice was calm, but Julia could hear the tension underneath. "There are things I have to take care of." Julia was taken aback. She had grown used to David being around, to the strange comfort of having him there. She had never expected him to leave, not like this. "Where are you going?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. David met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I have business to handle. It's not something I can explain right now, but I'll be back." Julia didn't know why, but she felt a tight knot form in her chest at the thought of him leaving. It wasn't just the physical absence she feared, it was the sense that she was losing the only constant she had found in the chaos of her life. "You can't just leave," Julia said, her voice breaking for the first time. "Not without telling me why." David hesitated, his eyes flickering with something that might have been guilt. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the same calm, detachment that Julia had grown to expect from him. "I'll explain when I get back," he said, his tone final. "I promise." And with that he turned and left, disappearing into the New York night, leaving Julia standing there, unsure of what to do next. The days that followed were filled with a strange emptiness. Julia went through the motions, but something was missing. David was gone, and with his absence, her apartment felt colder, quieter. The silence between them had been palpable, but now it felt suffocating. She could feel his absence in every corner of her small home. It was as if the walls themselves had been hollowed out, leaving only space and echoes behind. It wasn't until a week later that she heard from him again. The message came through as a simple text, nothing more than a few words. "I'm back. We need to talk." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what had happened, what had changed in that week, but she knew deep down that everything was about to shift. Whatever had been holding David back, whatever had kept him from opening up to her, was now coming to a head. When she opened the door to her apartment, she found him standing there, as calm and composed as ever. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper. Something that told her he wasn't the same man who had left just a few days ago. "I know you're wondering what happened," David began, his voice steady but tinged with something that was hard to place. "There's a lot I need to explain. About who I am. About what I've been running from." Julia swallowed hard, the uncertainty and fear bubbling up inside her. She had known there was something more to him than what he had shown, but she wasn't prepared for what he was about to say. David sighed as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'm not just some guy you met on the street. I'm David Allen Carr, the CEO of Harvin Technologies, and the man you've been living with is nothing like the one I'm about to show you." David's confession hit Julia like a tidal wave, sweeping away any semblance of certainty she had held on to. The calm, collected man who had shared her apartment for the past few weeks, the one who seemed so distant yet quietly familiar, was now telling her he wasn't who he claimed to be. Her mind raced, her thoughts clashing in a whirlwind of disbelief. How could it be possible? How could the man she had taken in, who had lived with her, been so close, be hiding such a monumental secret? "I'm David Allen Carr," he repeated, his voice steady, almost too steady for someone admitting something so incredible. "CEO of Harvin Technologies, the real me, the one you've been living with. That's not who I truly am." Julia stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up with the words he was saying. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. Her heart raced as confusion and anger surged through her. She couldn't understand it. How had he managed to hide this for so long? How had she been so blind? "Why didn't you tell me?" Julia's voice cracked, the hurt and disbelief seeping into every word. "Why lie to me? All this time I thought you were just a man with nowhere to go, a man who needed help. And now, this?" David's gaze faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He didn't seem ashamed, not exactly. He didn't seem guilty, but Julia could sense the weight of the words he was about to speak. "Because I didn't want to drag you into this," he said quietly. "You have no idea what it's like to live my life, to have everything you've worked for, everything you've built, ripped from you in the blink of an eye." Julia's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what he was saying. "Ripped from you," she repeated. "What do you mean? You're telling me you're a millionaire, a CEO, and you're living on the streets, hiding in alleyways like some person with nothing?" David closed his eyes briefly, as though trying to summon the right words. When he opened them again, there was a glimmer of something deeper, something darker. "I didn't choose this life," he said, his voice low. "I didn't ask for any of it. I had everything once. Harvin Technologies. It was my company. I built it from the ground up. But there were people in my life, people I trusted, who wanted it for themselves. And I paid the price. I lost everything. My company, my reputation, my identity." Julia swallowed hard, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he was saying. "And you thought living as a homeless man, hiding away in a back room in my apartment was the solution? Was that your way of escaping?" Her voice trembled with frustration. "You could have told me the truth. You could have trusted me. But instead you lied. You used me." David's face darkened, and for a brief moment Julia saw the person she had tried so hard to understand, the man she had opened her heart to. He wasn't just some homeless guy off the street. He wasn't just a lost soul. He was someone who had been broken by the very world he had once conquered. And yet he stood before her, still trying to hold on to his dignity, still trying to navigate the wreckage of his life. "I didn't want to involve you," he repeated. I thought if I stayed away, if I kept everything about my past buried, it would protect you. Protect both of us. Julia stared at him, her mind spinning. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to lash out at him for deceiving her, for keeping such a monumental secret hidden from her. But in that moment, she realized something that made her chest tighten. She didn't know how to feel anymore. This wasn't just about betrayal. This wasn't just about the lie he had told. It was about everything that had happened since the moment they met. About how he had quietly inserted himself into her life without ever asking for anything in return. How, despite everything, he had still managed to become someone important to her. I don't understand, she said, her voice softer now. If you were the CEO of Harvin Technologies, if you were someone with power, with influence, why did you just disappear? Why didn't you fight back? Why let people think you were dead? David let out a bitter laugh, his eyes darkening. Because I didn't have a choice. The people who took everything from me, Victor Olden and his group, they made sure that anyone who tried to expose them would be destroyed. They smeared my name, ruined my reputation. I couldn't fight back, not then, not when the world had already forgotten me. So I hid. I disappeared. I left everything behind. Julia felt a cold shiver run down her spine as his words settled in. She hadn't been part of this world, hadn't known the kind of business, deals, the kind of betrayal that could destroy someone's life. But now she understood. David wasn't just some fallen man. He was a man who had been betrayed by those he trusted most. He had been broken down, left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. And yet here he was, still fighting, still trying to hold on to something even though he had already lost so much. Why are you telling me this now? Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you want me to do with this information? What am I supposed to do with the knowledge that the man I've been living with is not who I thought he was? David's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment he looked vulnerable, completely exposed. I'm telling you because I need your help, he said quietly. I need someone to trust. Someone who can help me take back what was taken from me. Julia felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to say no. She wanted to turn away from this tangled mess of lies and broken promises. She wanted to keep her life simple, to move on from the chaos that had been building between them ever since she met him. But there was something in David's eyes, something in the way he said those words that made her hesitate. She had seen it in him. The same quiet resolve, the same determination to fix what had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, she had been right about him all along. Maybe he wasn't the man who had come into her life by chance. Maybe he was someone who had been waiting for the right moment to rebuild his life. What do you need me to do? Julia asked, her voice steady now, her heart racing. David stood up, taking a deep breath before speaking. I need you to help me get back into Harvin. I need access to the company again, behind the scenes where no one can stop me. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows how to navigate the system. Someone who can help me find the proof I need to bring Victor down once and for all. Julia looked at him, her mind racing. She had no experience in corporate affairs, no knowledge of the inner workings of a company like Harvin. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. I'll help you, she said, the words escaping her before she could think them through. But I need to know something first. David turned to her, waiting for her to continue. Why me? Julia asked, her voice low. Why did you come to me? Why not someone else? David hesitated for a moment before answering. Because you're the only person who hasn't judged me. The only one who has looked at me and seen more than just a broken man. You've given me more than anyone else ever could. You've given me hope. Julia's heart fluttered, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't just helping him because he needed it. She was helping him because in some strange way, they had become something more than just two people thrown together by fate. They had become allies in a world that had never given them a fair chance. David's eyes softened as he stepped closer to her. You're the one I need, Julia. And together we'll take down Victor. We'll take back what's ours. Julia nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The man she had opened her heart to was no longer just a mystery. He was David Allen Carr, a man with a past, with a story, and with a future that they would now face together. And whatever it took, Julia was ready to fight by his side. Julia's breath was shallow as she walked alongside David, the weight of their secret hanging heavily between them. The plan was in motion now, and she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that everything was about to change. She had never imagined herself in this situation. A woman from a humble background, thrown into a world of corporate espionage and deceit. But here she was, standing beside a man she had come to care for, who had just revealed to her the depths of his past, a past she could never have guessed. David's words echoed in her mind. "I need your help, Julia. I need you to help me take back what's mine, to bring Victor down." She hadn't been able to say no, not after everything they'd been through. His confession, his pain, his loss, all of it had touched her deeply, and now it felt like there was no turning back. The days that followed were filled with a sense of urgency. Julia had started her new job at Solverus, and though it was only a temporary position, it became clear that her involvement was about to become far more significant than she had ever anticipated. She worked quietly, trying to blend into the corporate world, but all the while she kept her eyes and ears open. There were conversations that slipped through the cracks, things that could potentially help David in his quest to take down Victor. Alden. There were phone calls, encrypted emails, and suspicious movements within the building that Julia had begun to notice. But the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. Every day she could feel the walls closing in. She had never imagined that a simple act of kindness, helping a man who had nothing, not knowing who he really was, would lead her to this point. Yet here she was, neck deep in a conspiracy that could ruin her life, and possibly David's. David, on the other hand, was working tirelessly behind the scenes. Julia had been surprised by how resourceful he was, despite his supposed fall from grace. He seemed to know every corner of the city, every contact that could provide a piece of the puzzle. As the days passed, he became more elusive, more distant, as if the weight of his past was pulling him into a darker place. But Julia could sense that it wasn't just his past haunting him. It was the pressure of everything that lay ahead. It wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even about reclaiming what had been taken from him. It was about restoring his dignity, his sense of self. He had lost everything, his company, his name, his identity, and now he was fighting to take back something that had once been his, something that mattered more than money or power. It was about proving to himself that he could still be the man he had once been, that he could rise from the ashes. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of work, Julia returned home to find David sitting quietly in the living room, staring at a set of documents spread out in front of him. His face was unreadable, and for the first time she could see the toll that all of this was taking on him. The man she had met on the street, the one who had seemed so strong despite his circumstances, was starting to unravel. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly, crossing the room to sit beside him. She had learned over the past few weeks that David wasn't the type to open up easily, but he had been more distant than usual lately. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed the documents aside and looked at her, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "I'm not sure anymore," he finally said, his voice low. "I've spent years building something, creating a legacy, and now it feels like it's all slipping through my fingers. I've got one shot at this, Julia. One chance to bring Victor down and restore what's mine. But it's not just about the company, it's about my own redemption. If I fail, if I can't make this right, I'll never be able to live with myself." Julia's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice. She had never seen him like this, so raw, so human. It was a side of him that he had kept hidden, buried beneath the layers of his past. She reached out, placing her hand on his. "You're not alone in this, David," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm here. We're in this together. I don't know exactly what we're up against, but I'm not backing down. We'll figure it out. We always do." David's gaze softened, and for a moment Julia could see the man he had once been, the one who had been driven by ambition and the desire to create something meaningful. But she also saw the man who was struggling to let go of his past, who was still trying to find his place in a world that had turned its back on him. He didn't need her sympathy, but in that moment he needed her belief, and she realized that she needed him too, not just as the man she had taken into her home, but as someone who had shown her the power of resilience. "We'll do this together," David agreed, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But I have to warn you, Julia. Once we go down this path, there's no going back. Victor won't give up easily. He'll do whatever it takes to protect what he's built." Julia nodded, her mind racing with everything that was at stake. She had never imagined that her life would be so tangled with David's, but there was no denying that it was now inextricably linked to his. The stakes were higher than ever, and the more she learned about Victor and his plans, the more dangerous everything became. The next few days passed in a blur of secrecy and tension. Julia continued her work at Solverus, gathering as much information as she could while David worked to make contact with old allies searching for any way to take down Victor. They had come so far, but it wasn't enough yet. They needed the evidence, the smoking gun that would expose everything. But then, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, Julia received an email that sent a chill down her spine. It was from an anonymous source, someone inside Harvin Technologies, someone who had been watching the events unfold from the shadows. The email contained a single line of text. "Victor is planning a deal. A merger. If you want to stop him, you need to act fast." Julia's heart raced as she read the message again. A merger? What did that mean? And why had someone inside Harvin decided to contact her now? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they were still so far from the truth. The email contained no details, no clues as to who the source was or how they had come by this information. But it was enough to make Julia realize that the stakes had just been raised. She immediately forwarded the email to David, her fingers trembling as she typed a quick message. "We need to talk. This is bigger than we thought. Meet me tonight." David replied within minutes, his response as urgent as hers. "I'll be there." That night, as the two of them sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the weight of what they were about to face hung heavily in the air. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they were nearing the end of their journey, one way or another. The next move would decide everything. David leaned forward, his hands clenched tightly together as he stared at the email on the screen. "If this is true," he said, his voice tight with determination, "Victor's plan will destroy everything I've worked for. Harvin will become nothing more than a shell. And when the merger is complete, it'll be too late to stop him." Julia felt a wave of anger rise within her. She had known that Victor was ruthless, but the idea that he was willing to dismantle everything, destroy everything, just to make a profit, was something she couldn't accept. She had to believe that there was still a chance to stop him, still a way to bring justice to the people who had been deceived. "We can't let him win," Julia said, her voice firm. "We can't let him get away with it." David nodded, his eyes blazing with a fire she hadn't seen in him before. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting for his own redemption. He was fighting for something bigger, for justice, for the truth, for everything that had been lost along the way. Together they would take on Victor. Together they would expose the man who had taken everything from David and destroy his empire, piece by piece. The air was thick with tension as Julia and David stood together, facing a future that neither of them had anticipated. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a homeless man with nowhere to go, had led them into a whirlwind of deception, danger, and ultimately a fight for the truth. They had come a long way from the alley where they had first met, and now they stood on the precipice of a final confrontation that could either restore everything David had lost or tear them apart forever. David's eyes were filled with determination, yet there was an unmistakable sadness behind them, a reminder of all that had been lost. He was no longer the man who had walked through the streets of New York, hidden beneath layers of deception. No, this was the man who had fought tooth and nail to regain control of his destiny. The past few months had tested him in ways he could never have imagined, but now he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Julia too was different. She had entered this battle as an outsider, someone with nothing to lose. But now she had everything at stake: her job, her reputation, and most importantly, her growing feelings for David. She had stepped into a world of high-stakes corporate drama, but the longer she stayed by his side, the more she realized that it wasn't just about the company. It was about the man. And as she looked at him now, standing there with quiet strength, she knew she couldn't let him face this alone. In the days leading up to the final showdown with Victor, they worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence they had gathered. It was more than just documents and emails. It was a blueprint for destruction, a map of corruption that could take down Harvin Technologies and the man who had been at its helm. But they knew that their plan wasn't foolproof. They would have to be careful. One wrong move and everything they had worked for would crumble. David had made it clear from the beginning. This wasn't just about him. It was about bringing justice to the people who had been deceived by Victor's lies. It was about protecting the legacy of the company he had built and ensuring that no one else would suffer the way he had. But as the day of reckoning approached, Julia could see the toll it was taking on him. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and though he tried to hide it, she knew that the weight of it all was starting to break him. She could no longer ignore the truth. David was fighting, not just for the company, but for himself. He had lost everything once before. The thought of losing it again, of being left with nothing but memories and regrets, was a fate he could not bear. The night before the final confrontation, Julia found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the city that had become both their battleground and their refuge. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the streets, and for a moment she felt a sense of peace wash over her. But it didn't last long. The reality of what lay ahead loomed large, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, whether they were ready for it or not. David had told her that he wasn't afraid of Victor, but Julia knew that fear was a powerful thing. And while David had always been the one to carry the weight of their plan, it was Julia who had to carry the weight of the truth. She had spent so many months believing that her actions were just a means to an end, that helping David was simply the right thing to do. But now, with the final pieces of their plan in place, she realized that it wasn't just about the company or the betrayal. It was about what they had built together and the love that had slowly, quietly started to bloom between them. Julia didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if David would succeed, if the truth would come to light, or if Victor would finally get the justice he deserved. But what she did know, as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, was that she had no regrets. She had chosen to stand by David, not because he was a CEO or because he had been a homeless man once. She had chosen to stand by him because he was a man who had proven time and time again that he was worthy of trust. That night, David didn't come home until after midnight. Julia had been waiting for him, her mind swirling with doubt and uncertainty. But when he finally walked through the door, there was a certain calmness in his eyes, something that told her that he was ready to face whatever came next. "I'm ready," he said simply, dropping his bag by the door and walking toward her. Julia smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I know you are." The next morning, the final confrontation began. They met at the Magnolia Hotel, a sleek modern building that exuded wealth and power. Julia had been to countless events in her life, but this one felt different. This one felt like the beginning of the end. The ballroom was filled with executives and investors, their faces familiar but distant. Everyone was waiting for Victor Alden to arrive, and Julia could sense the tension in the air. They were all there for one reason: to make sure that the merger between Harvin Technologies and its shell companies went through smoothly. But Julia knew better. She knew that everything was about to change. David had already arrived, though he was dressed under an assumed name. He was wearing a tailored suit, his hair combed neatly, his face devoid of any expression. Julia had never seen him look so composed, so focused. This was a man who was about to take back everything that had been stolen from him. "I'll be watching from the back," Julia whispered as she handed him a small earpiece. "I'll keep an eye on everything." David gave her a small nod, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was no one else in the room, just the two of them. The weight of everything that had led them to this point hung between them, unspoken but understood. "Just remember," he said quietly, "this isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure this never happens again. No one else should have to suffer the way I did." Julia nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She wasn't just fighting for David anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been manipulated, lied to, and betrayed by those in power. She was fighting for the truth. As David walked toward the front of the room, Julia took her place at the back, blending in with the crowd. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her mind was racing with the thought of what lay ahead. But she knew that there was no turning back. The time had come. Victor Alden entered the ballroom with his usual smug confidence, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as he surveyed the room. He had no idea that the walls were closing in around him. He had no idea that this would be the last time he would stand in the spotlight as the CEO of Harvin Technologies. David stood up as Victor reached the podium, his voice carrying through the room with authority. "Gentlemen, today is a historic day," Victor began. Today we take a crucial step forward in the future of this company. We merge with a new partner, one that will secure our place at the top of the industry for years to come. But as he spoke, David stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. This merger is nothing but a sham, David declared, his voice steady but filled with conviction. It's a cover-up for the theft of a company, and you, Victor, are at the heart of it. The truth is, you've been running this company into the ground, and I have the evidence to prove it. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Julia watched. From the back, her heart racing. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Victor's face twisted in fury as he turned to face David. You have no proof, he spat. But David simply smiled. Oh, I do. And it's all on record. Every transaction, every deal you've made under the table. You can't hide from the truth anymore. Julia could see the panic in Victor's eyes now. He had no choice but to back down. The evidence was irrefutable, and the room was filled with witnesses. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the police moved in to arrest Victor, David stood tall, the weight of years of loss and betrayal finally lifting from his shoulders. He had done it. He had taken back what was rightfully his, and more importantly, he had exposed the truth. Later that night, as Julia and David sat together in her apartment, the adrenaline of the day still pulsing through their veins, David turned. To her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. You did it, he said softly. You helped me take him down. Julia smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. We did it. Together. David reached out and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. I couldn't have done it without you, Julia. You've shown me what really matters in life. It's not the power, not the money, not the legacy. It's the people who stand by you when everything falls apart. It's you. Julia's heart swelled with emotion as she looked into his eyes. She had known from the beginning that this was more than just a fight for a company. This was about trust, redemption, and love. And as they sat there hand in hand, they both knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where they would write their own story together. Throughout this incredible journey, Julia and David's story unfolds as a tale of transformation, trust, and redemption. From the moment Julia, a humble woman struggling to find her way, offered a kind gesture to a homeless man, who was later revealed to be the missing millionaire CEO, their lives would be irrevocably intertwined. What started as an act of compassion led them both down a tumultuous path filled with deception, betrayal, and a quest for truth. David, once lost and broken by the betrayal of his own company, found not just a new beginning but also the courage to reclaim his past. Julia, a woman, searching for her purpose, stood by him with unwavering support, discovering her own strength in the process. Together they exposed the corruption that had plagued David's empire and fought for justice, not just for him but for everyone affected by the lies and greed of powerful men. The lesson here is profound. True strength lies in standing by what is right, no matter the odds. Compassion, trust, and the courage to fight for justice can lead to redemption and change. In your own life, never underestimate the power of kindness or the importance of fighting for truth. What are your thoughts on Julia and David's story? Do you believe that trust and compassion can lead to powerful transformations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support future stories.